I'm just there. I've made a promise to myself that I'm going to make these, that I'm making them for an audience. And when I'm done, I'm going to feel like, okay, that was what I was supposed to do. And they live forever. Good or bad, they live forever. And then it clicks. And then and that's what happens when two. And I was going to let them know, no, I'm not doing this. You know, in this way, it's not going to happen. I'm not in that mix.
The setting was Santa Barbara on a warm evening in late March 2026. And the 1805 live benefit was doing what it always did, projecting the particular kind of polished ease that expensive charity events along the California coast have perfected over decades. Guests arrived in elegant evening attire. Conversations drifted across the seaside estate. To anyone watching the footage later, the evening suggested warmth and celebration and the specific glow of influential people gathered around a cause they were prepared to be publicly associated with. Kevin Costner was present. Oscar-winning actor, director, producer, a man who had spent 4 decades building a reputation in Hollywood that was, in the specific way of reputations built over that kind of time, almost impossible to fully characterize. He was not known for feuds. He was not known for dramatic declarations or the kind of public performances that the entertainment industry sometimes produces when its participants mistake notoriety for influence. He was known for independence, for the particular quality of self-possession that comes from having navigated a career on its own terms, making choices that didn't always follow the path of least resistance, and arriving, after all of it, with his credibility intact. When Kevin Costner said something in a room, people listened, not because of celebrity, because of the specific weight that genuine independence carries in an environment where genuine independence is comparatively rare. On this evening, he said something that changed the temperature of the room immediately and completely. He was not speaking to a large audience. He was not making a prepared statement or delivering a keynote. He was in conversation, the kind of semi-private exchange that happens at events like this between people who know each other well enough to speak plainly. And what he said, plainly, was that Meghan Markle would not be invited to future gatherings held at his private estate connected to the 1805 live benefit. The remark was not shouted. It was not performed for effect. It was delivered with the even, unhurried clarity of someone communicating a decision that had already been made and required no elaboration. Conversations slowed around him. Stunned looks moved quietly across the room in the way that looks move in spaces where powerful people have trained themselves not to react visibly to surprising information, which is to say that the reactions were subtle and entirely unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of the room. In Hollywood, where diplomacy and careful phrasing dominate almost every public interaction, where statements are managed and positions are hedged, and even significant decisions are usually communicated through representatives and press releases, rather than in the middle of a charity event in Santa Barbara, in that environment, a remark like this doesn't simply register as an opinion, it registers as a signal. And signals in Hollywood travel with remarkable efficiency through the networks of people whose livelihoods depend on understanding them correctly. This was not, on its surface, a dramatic event. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody produced a document or made an accusation or called a press conference. A man said a woman would not be invited to his estate. That was the entirety of what occurred in that room on that evening. Yet within 48 hours, the remark had traveled through media circles, industry conversations, and across the Atlantic to London, where people whose job it is to monitor narratives that might affect the British monarchy were reading about it in briefings that used words like developing and concerning and watch. Because the remark was not really about an invitation list. It was about something that the invitation list symbolized, a door and the specific and visible act of closing it. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what the 1805 live benefit actually is, and what Kevin Costner's relationship to it represents, and why his decision, quiet, unelaborated, delivered without drama in a room that suddenly went very still, carried the weight it carried in both the industry where it was spoken and the institution across an ocean that heard it. The 1805 had become, over the years, something more significant than its charitable purpose suggested. Along the California coast, certain gatherings function as neutral ground where the industry's most influential figures interact in conditions that are simultaneously relaxed and carefully managed, relaxed enough that real conversations happen, managed enough that the right people are in the same room at the same time. The 1805 Live benefit had acquired that status gradually and without any explicit announcement, in the way that these things happen when the right combination of organizers, causes, and participants come together consistently enough that attendance begins to carry its own meaning. Within the industry, the event had long been seen as an exclusive meeting ground where influence quietly meets philanthropy. Invitations alone carried weight. Attendance signaled belonging not to the entertainment industry in general, which is enormous and various and contains multitudes, but to a specific stratum of it, the producers, executives, investors, and influential artists who operate at the level where decisions get made rather than the level where they get announced. For several years after relocating to Montecito, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had been working to establish a presence in exactly this kind of environment. The Sussex brand, in its California configuration, had been built around the idea that royal heritage and Hollywood opportunity could be combined into something new, a platform for storytelling and philanthropy that would be sustained by the relationships formed in precisely these kinds of rooms. Costner's association with the event was not incidental. His career had given him credibility across multiple dimensions of the entertainment industry as a performer, as a producer, as someone whose instincts about projects and partnerships had been tested repeatedly over decades. His presence at 1805 Live was the presence of someone whose participation validated the event for the kinds of people the event was designed to attract. Which is why his decision to draw a line quiet, personal, communicated without fanfare in the middle of an evening that was otherwise proceeding normally landed with the force it did. In Hollywood, relationships determine opportunity. Doors open or close without public explanation, without press releases, without the kind of formal announcement that gives the person on the other side the opportunity to respond. Costner had closed a door. The people in that room understood what a closed door meant. On the stage that same evening, Harry appeared to accept an award with the ease of someone who had navigated enough public appearances to perform composure, even when composure was not entirely how he felt. Applause filled the space. Cameras flashed. For viewers watching the coverage afterward, the scene suggested celebration and warmth. For those watching from within the room, the surface and the subtext had begun to diverge in ways that would take weeks to fully resolve. Eyewitnesses who were physically present at the 1805 Live benefit that evening recalled something that the official footage did not capture, and the subsequent coverage largely failed to convey. The atmosphere was unusually restrained, not hostile, not openly confrontational, not the kind of tension that produces raised voices or visible disagreements that give observers something concrete to describe. It was the more unsettling kind of restraint, the kind that manifests as absence, as the specific social negative space created when warmth that should be present is instead withheld. In rooms where reputation and influence move through subtle gestures, body language functions as its own language, and the people who have spent their careers in these environments have developed a fluency in it that most outsiders don't possess. Costner's demeanor throughout the evening was described by multiple witnesses as carefully reserved. His exchanges with Meghan Markle remained brief and controlled polite nods, quick acknowledgments, nothing that would register as hostile on any recording, but also none of the easy conversation or extended engagement that would normally characterize interactions between guests of similar status at an event of this kind. In a social world where the warmth of a greeting carries information about the relationship it represents, the brevity of those exchanges communicated something that a longer conversation would have concealed. What made the observation memorable to those present was precisely its understatement. There were no raised voices. There was no scene. No moment that a camera could have captured as evidence of conflict or confrontation. In Hollywood's carefully managed social world, Tension rarely appears through open conflict. Conflict is conspicuous, and conspicuous things become stories, and stories are managed and eventually resolved. Their edges smoothed by communications professionals and sympathetic coverage until the original energy is absorbed and dissipated. Tension reveals itself instead through absence, a conversation that never begins, a greeting lasting only seconds, a warmth that is performed when cameras are present and withheld when they are not. The people who noticed the distance between Costner and Meghan that evening were noticing the absence of something that should have been there. In rooms where everyone is operating at a high level of social awareness, where every interaction is at least partially calibrated for the impression it creates and the relationship it represents, the withdrawal of normal warmth is a statement as legible as any spoken sentence. And the absence, to those who understood what they were seeing and who had enough context to interpret it accurately, spoke with a clarity that any direct statement would have struggled to match, without the kind of escalation that neither party appeared to have any interest in producing. Some guests believe the distance was intentional, that Costner had arrived at the event having already made a decision and was simply allowing that decision to be visible in the specific way that choices made by people with genuine independence are always visible. Others speculated that something had shifted before the event began, in the private conversations and communications that precede gatherings of this kind, and that shape what happens in them before a single guest arrives. What united both interpretations was the recognition that this was not a coincidence and not a misreading. The man who had built a career on firm personal boundaries was maintaining one. The only question was, what had produced it? In the days following the 1,805 live benefit, the situation took a turn that transformed what had seemed like a personal social distance into something considerably more significant. A comment attributed to Costner began circulating through media circles and private industry conversations, a remark that moved beyond the guest list question and into territory whose implications extended far beyond Santa Barbara. According to reports that began spreading among Hollywood insiders in late March 2026, Costner had allegedly mentioned Meghan Markle in the same context as the long shadow cast by the Jeffrey Epstein controversy. The reference was brief. It was not an accusation. It was not presented with evidence or elaboration. But the effect of even an indirect association from a voice carrying the credibility that Costner's did, in the environment where he was making it, was immediate and deeply unsettling to the people who heard it and began passing it along through the channels through which such things travel in the entertainment industry. The name Epstein carries a weight in both Hollywood and royal circles that is difficult to overstate without sounding like hyperbole, but the reality is that hyperbole in this context is barely adequate. The scandal surrounding the late financier had already delivered one of the most damaging blows to the modern British monarchy in living memory. Prince Andrew's association with Epstein produced years of relentless headlines, legal battles, public outrage, and the kind of reputational damage that does not fade because it is periodically refreshed by new revelations and new documentation. The fallout ultimately forced Andrew to step back from royal duties, withdraw from public life, and lose the military titles and honorary roles that had defined his public identity. The imagery, court records, and testimony linked to the case had left marks on the institution that years of careful communications management had been unable to erase. Because of that history, even the faintest suggestion, connecting another figure with royal connections to the same narrative, carried implications that people on both sides of the Atlantic would feel compelled to take seriously. The difference between this and the scattered, unverified rumors that had occasionally surfaced in obscure corners of the internet was the source. Kevin Costner was not a tabloid writer or an anonymous online commentator. He was an Oscar-winning filmmaker with decades of influence in the entertainment industry, whose reputation rested on professionalism, independence, and a track record of saying what he meant. His words, when they entered the public conversation, carried a credibility that anonymous online speculation could never approach. The response was swift and spread along multiple channels simultaneously. Conversations erupted among executives and producers across Los Angeles. Media strategists and corporate advisors began examining the situation carefully, aware that narratives could shift with remarkable speed in a media environment driven by momentum rather than confirmation. The story crossed the Atlantic. Within royal circles, advisors responsible for protecting the reputation of the monarchy began monitoring the discussion closely. The British royal family had spent years attempting to contain the damage caused by the Epstein controversy. Any development that appeared to reopen that chapter from any direction involving any name connected to the institution immediately raised alarm within palace communications teams. Inside Buckingham Palace, the timing of the developing situation could hardly have been more challenging. The royal family was navigating one of the most delicate periods in recent memory as spring 2026 arrived. King Charles III continued managing ongoing health concerns that had limited some public appearances and placed greater pressure on the remaining senior royals to maintain the visibility that the institution required to function. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was still managing the longer road of her own recovery. With fewer working royals consistently available to represent the crown in the full range of public contexts that demanded a royal presence, the institution was operating with less margin for additional complications than it would have wished. The last thing palace officials needed was the revival of a controversy linked to the Epstein scandal, the most damaging reputational crisis the modern monarchy had faced, and one whose wounds had never fully healed despite years of careful management. The Prince Andrew fallout had demonstrated something that the palace had been reluctant to acknowledge publicly, but had been forced to confront operationally. That the institution was not immune to the kind of cumulative reputational damage that comes from sustained association with matters of serious public concern. When Andrew's situation had reached its crisis point, the palace had responded with actions it had never previously contemplated: the removal of military titles, the withdrawal of official roles, the enforced withdrawal from public duties. Those actions had been unprecedented. They had also been necessary. And the people inside the palace who had made them knew that the threshold for similar necessity could be reached again if the circumstances demanded it. Legal advisors, constitutional specialists, and senior aides began examining scenarios that had previously been treated as theoretical, examining them not as planning exercises or hypothetical discussions, but as genuine contingency preparation for outcomes that the developing situation made plausible in ways they had not been plausible before. Central among those scenarios was a question that touched the deepest traditions of British royal history: whether titles connected to the family could be formally withdrawn if reputational damage reached a threshold that threatened the crown's credibility with the public it served. Such a step would involve constitutional procedures of significant complexity, political implications reaching far beyond the palace walls, and a public process that could not be quietly managed. But the fact that it was being seriously examined revealed the scale of the concern that the developing situation had generated in the corridors of British royal power. Within palace legal offices and constitutional advisory rooms, the attention of experts had quietly converged on a piece of legislation that had remained largely dormant for more than a century. The Titles Deprivation Act of 1917 had been created during one of the most turbulent moments in British history, a moment when Parliament was forced to address the specific and sensitive question of what to do about aristocrats and noble figures who held royal titles while maintaining connections to nations with which Britain was at war. The context of the legislation's original passage had been the First World War, when the awkward reality of the British royal family's extensive German connections had become politically impossible to ignore. Several noble families whose titles were rooted in the same Germanic aristocratic networks that produced the Kaiser had found themselves in a position of symbolic incompatibility with a Britain locked in devastating conflict with Germany. Parliament's solution was to establish, in formal legal terms, a principle that had previously existed only as a kind of unwritten assumption: that royal titles, for all their centuries of tradition and their apparent permanence, were not, in fact, untouchable privileges. They could be withdrawn by the monarch if their holders were judged to have acted in ways that were harmful to the interests of the crown and the nation. The Act established this principle in statute and provided a procedural mechanism for its application. For decades afterward, it had functioned primarily as a symbolic statement of the monarchy's theoretical authority over its own honorific architecture. Modern royal scandals had been managed through softer measures: the removal of public duties, the quiet withdrawal of official responsibilities, the careful management of public appearances. The act itself had not been invoked in any meaningful way in living memory. But the Andrew precedent, the willingness of the institution to take unprecedented action when reputational damage reached a certain threshold, had demonstrated that the monarchy was capable of deploying its formal authorities in ways that would previously have been considered unthinkable. Now, for the first time in a sustained and serious way, constitutional specialists within the palace were examining whether the threshold conditions of the 1917 Act might eventually apply to the current situation. The process such an invocation would require was not simple. Government involvement would be necessary since any action connected to formal royal titles carries political implications that extend beyond the palace. Parliamentary engagement would likely follow, opening discussions within both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, involving politicians, constitutional scholars, and legal authorities across the full range of British institutions. The symbolic weight of such a debate would be enormous. Royal titles represented stability and continuity within British tradition in ways that went beyond their practical function, and the idea that one could be formally stripped in the modern era carried implications that the institution's advisors were not underestimating. The significance of the 1917 Act's return to serious internal discussion was not that action was imminent or certain. It was that the discussion was happening at all. For years, the palace had managed the Sussex question through the measured application of administrative and diplomatic tools, adjusting privileges, reclassifying statuses, withdrawing specific endorsements and authorizations. The fact that constitutional specialists were now reviewing legislation from a century ago, in the context of a developing situation whose full dimensions had not yet become clear, revealed the degree to which the calculus had changed. What had once seemed unthinkable was being thought about. What had once seemed like a distant hypothetical was being examined as a genuine contingency. The Act of 1917 had been passed in a moment of crisis. It was being studied in another one. Thousands of miles from the palace corridors where constitutional specialists were quietly reviewing century-old legislation, another shift was taking shape in California. In the entertainment industry, where the Sussex brand had been constructed as a post-royal enterprise, the discussion surrounding the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had begun to change in tone and register in ways that carried their own significant implications. Behind closed doors in Los Angeles boardrooms and in the quieter conversations between agents and executives that shape the industry's understanding of where opportunity and risk are distributed, decision makers were reviewing the nature of their partnerships and associations with renewed caution. In modern entertainment, reputation plays a central and highly quantifiable role in protecting corporate investments. Agreements between celebrities and media companies almost always contain morality clauses, legal provisions that protect a brand's investment if a public figure becomes associated with controversy that could damage the company's image or its relationship with its audience. For organizations that manage global platforms and billion-dollar content budgets, the calculation is never primarily emotional, it is strategic. When a partnership begins to carry reputational risk that was not present when the contract was signed, executives are not merely permitted to evaluate whether that association still serves their interests. They are, in some cases, obligated to do so. The Netflix partnership had been the most visible symbol of the Sussex brand's Hollywood ambitions, announced with great anticipation, positioned as a demonstration of the couple's ability to translate royal recognition and global name recognition into a sustainable media enterprise. The agreement had generated enormous initial attention and had represented, at the moment of its announcement, a genuine validation of the bet the Sussexes had made when they relocated to California and constructed their post-royal identity around media production and storytelling. Corporate analysts monitoring the developing situation were now examining how the narrative that had been building since the Santa Barbara event might affect those projects and that relationship going forward. What made this recalculation particularly significant in its implications was the source of the pressure driving it. For years, much of the negative coverage surrounding Meghan Markle had originated in the British tabloid press, a media environment that her supporters had consistently characterized as hostile, culturally biased, and motivated by an institutional investment in a particular narrative about who she was and what she represented. That characterization had provided a framework within which criticism could be managed and contextualized. Tabloid hostility as the predictable response of a traditional institution to a figure whose presence challenged its assumptions. That framework was now under strain because the most consequential voice raising questions about the Sussex brand was not a British tabloid. It was Kevin Costner, an American, a Hollywood insider. A respected figure within the very industry the Sussexes had chosen as the foundation of their new professional life. His voice carried a credibility that the British press had never been able to claim in the California context, and it was pointing in the same direction that the palace's own concerns were pointing from across the Atlantic. Powerful representation agencies that had played a role in managing the Sussex brand's commercial relationships began the specific kind of internal recalibration that happens when the risk profile of a client relationship changes in ways that affect the agency's broader portfolio. In competitive environments where reputation is both a product and a resource, the calculus around which clients to actively champion and which to manage with greater caution is continuous and unsentimental. The industry was not abandoning the Sussexes. The situation had not reached the kind of decisive threshold that produces formal terminations and public statements. But it was reconsidering. And reconsidering is the stage that precedes deciding. While the recalculations were proceeding in both London and Los Angeles, the figure at the center of the developing situation was doing something that observers who had been following his trajectory closely found striking in its contrast with the surrounding turbulence. Prince Harry was appearing at events largely on his own. The pattern had begun to emerge in the early months of 2026, where previous years had seen many of Harry's public appearances closely integrated with Meghan Markle and the joint projects that formed the foundation of the Sussex enterprise. The prince increasingly appeared without her at Invictus Games preparations, at humanitarian engagements, at events connected to the causes that had defined his public identity long before it became entangled with the controversies of the California years. The change was subtle at first. It became harder to ignore as it continued. At events connected to the Invictus Games, the international sporting competition Harry had founded to support wounded and injured military veterans, cameras captured him engaging with athletes, military families, and organizers with a quality of presence that reminded longtime observers of something they had not seen from him in some time. He spoke with confidence about resilience and recovery and the importance of honoring those who served. He listened to veterans with the attention of someone who had served himself and understood something about the specific weight of military experience that most civilians do not. In those moments, unmediated by brand management or narrative construction or the machinery of the Sussex media enterprise, he appeared to reconnect with something that had been genuinely his, a role that no commercial partnership or celebrity network had manufactured, that had emerged from his own choices and his own experience, and that remained, despite everything that had happened since, recognizably authentic. A humanitarian visit to Angola in the same period carried its own resonance. Harry joined organizations working to clear landmines from areas still affected by past conflict work that carried powerful symbolic weight through its connection to his mother, Princess Diana, who had drawn global attention to the landmine issue when she walked through a minefield in protective gear during a historic awareness campaign years before her death. The echo was not manufactured. It did not require explanation or context setting. People saw it and felt it because the connection was real. A son doing work that his mother had pioneered, in the specific kind of active, engaged, unglamorous way that had always distinguished the best of the Diana legacy from its imitations. These appearances revealed something important about Harry's current position, but they also revealed the tension contained within it. The work he was doing at Invictus Games events and in Angola was the work of a man whose public identity had been formed within the royal institution, shaped by military service, by the specific obligations of royal duty, by the tradition of charitable engagement that the monarchy has practiced for generations. It was work that made sense within that framework, that drew meaning from it, that could not have been done by someone who was simply a Hollywood executive or a California philanthropist or a celebrity with a media production company. Yet Harry was no longer within that framework. He had made choices that had carried him out of it into a different world with different rules and different metrics for success and different relationships that determined what opportunities opened and what doors remained closed. The empire he and Meghan had constructed since relocating to Montecito was built on the assumption that the value of the royal heritage they carried with them would remain useful in the Hollywood context indefinitely, that the brand could sustain itself on the combination of royal recognition and California ambition without requiring either the formal institutional support of the monarchy or the particular kind of rootedness that genuine Hollywood careers take years to develop. What the events of spring 2026 were revealing was that this assumption had a durability problem. The royal heritage was losing institutional support as the palace examined its options and its advisors reviewed century-old legislation, and the relationship between Harry's family and the crown moved through its complicated, ongoing evolution. The Hollywood opportunity was being reconsidered by the very executives and agencies whose buy-in had been essential to the California enterprise's viability. And the man standing in the middle of those two receding tides was visible in his appearances at Invictus Games events and his visits to Angola, doing work that reminded everyone of who he had been before any of this began. The question that had crystallized around the Costner moment, around the closed door and the quiet remark, and the reverberations that followed it through two industries and across an ocean, was the question that Harry was navigating in real time, in public, without the benefit of a clear answer. Where does a prince actually belong when the world he left no longer looks the way he remembered it, and the world he chose no longer looks the way he hoped? The men and women at the 1,805 live benefit who had watched Kevin Costner maintain his polite distance across an evening had been watching something that contained, in miniature, the shape of a much larger question. It was a question about belonging, about the specific cost of choices that cannot be revisited, about what happens when the bridges you burned are the only ones that led anywhere you actually knew how to go. What had begun as a restrained social distance at a charity gathering along the California coast had, within weeks, evolved into something that was being discussed in palace briefings, entertainment industry boardrooms, constitutional advisory sessions, and the international media landscape that connects all of those spaces into a single narrative environment that nobody fully controls, but everybody inhabits. The speed of that evolution from a quiet remark at a seaside estate to formal discussions about century-old legislation within the British constitutional system was itself a measure of how much the underlying situation had changed and how much had been waiting for a single moment of sufficient credibility and specificity to crystallize around. Kevin Costner had not set out to become the catalyst for any of it. His remarks were brief, personal, and delivered without the kind of strategic calculation that produces press releases and carefully timed media strategies. He was a man with firm personal limits, communicating one of those limits in the plain, direct language of someone who had spent a long career resisting the pressure to be otherwise. But in an environment where powerful people rarely speak directly, where influence operates through implication and suggestion and the carefully managed distance between what is said and what is meant, directness travels further and faster than almost anything else. A door closed in Santa Barbara could be heard in London. The Hollywood that had once welcomed the Sussexes with genuine enthusiasm was now conducting the quiet, internal, undramatic recalculation that industries conduct when the risk profile of an association changes. Not dramatically, not with press conferences, in the way that large organizations actually move, Through the slow revision of internal assessments and the gradual reallocation of attention and resources toward relationships that carry less complication. The palace was examining options it had not previously needed to examine in any serious way, consulting legislation that had not been invoked in living memory, measuring a situation against thresholds it had hoped it would never need to apply. And Harry was doing the work that had always been his, connecting with veterans, honoring his mother's legacy in Angola's minefields, showing up for causes that did not require any brand positioning to justify, while the two worlds he stood between conducted their respective recalculations around him. Whether the events of March 2026 would ultimately prove to be a turning point or simply another chapter in a story that had always found a way to generate new chapters was a question that the events themselves could not answer. What they had made visible was the specific fragility of a position constructed on the assumption that the royal heritage and the Hollywood opportunity would remain mutually reinforcing indefinitely. They had revealed the speed with which a quiet remark from a respected voice can accelerate a shift in perception that had been building for months but lacked a single moment around which to crystallize. And they had placed Harry, once again, at the intersection of two worlds whose demands were increasingly incompatible: a prince without a palace and a Hollywood figure without a clear path, navigating a crossroads that nobody else could navigate for him in the only way such crossroads can ever be navigated, one choice at a time, in real time, without the luxury of knowing how the story ends.